This is a true crime story about a lynching that a sheriff made possible. A sheriff who drove 3 black men down a dark Alabama highway in the middle of the night, and when armed, masked men stopped his car and demanded his prisoners, he handed them over without a struggle. 2 of those men were dead before sunrise. Their bodies were found the next morning beneath a tree in Tuscaloosa County, still handcuffed to each other, riddled with bullets. One was 18 years old, the other was 16. And here is the part that should make your blood run cold, the murder that put them in that car in the first place. It was never actually solved, because in Jim Crow, Alabama in 1933, finding the real killer mattered far less than finding a black man to blame. This is the true crime story of Dan Pippin Jr., A.T. Harden, and Elmore Clark. This is the story of a racial injustice that was carried out in plain sight, reported in newspapers, investigated by a grand jury, and still resulted in 0 arrests, 0 convictions, and 0 accountability. This is what Jim Crow looked like from the inside. Hey, I'm T. Welcome to Black Crime Noir, where we cover true crime stories centered on black experiences. The cases mainstream media buried, the names history tried to forget. Every single week, we dig up the truth. If you're new here, subscribe and hit the bell icon so you don't miss any uploads. Now, let's get into it. Before we can talk about what happened on that highway, we have to go back 2 months. And we have to start with the murder at the center of this true crime case, because without understanding who Vaudean Maddox was and how badly her death was investigated, nothing that followed makes any sense. Vaudean Maddox was a 21-year-old white woman. She grew up in Big Sandy, Alabama, a small rural community about 12 miles south of Tuscaloosa. Poor family, farming country. The kind of place where a 2-room house was a home and hard work was just Tuesday. When Vaudean was 12 years old, her mother died. And without anyone asking her permission, the oldest child in the family became the person holding everything together. She cooked, she cleaned, she looked after her younger siblings for 9 years. Not because it was glamorous, not because she had a choice, because somebody had to, and she was the somebody. She also picked up extra work from an elderly white couple who lived across the woods, cooking and gardening, the physical labor their aging bodies could no longer manage. Another way to contribute, another way to keep the family afloat. On the morning of June 12, 1933, Vaudean Maddox woke up early. She filled a pail with flour and set off down the clay road toward a neighbor's house. She never arrived. Days passed. Her family searched. And then her body was found in a ravine not far from the road she would have walked. She had been struck. A large rock found near the scene was believed to be the murder weapon and dragged approximately 200 feet off the highway. Now here is where this case starts to fall apart at the seams, and where the racial injustice at the heart of it becomes impossible to ignore. Investigators found no sign of a struggle at the scene. Whatever happened to Vaudean did not begin as a surprise attack. It began as a conversation. Reports noted explicitly that she appeared to have known whoever she last spoke to, that she had talked with them at length, comfortably, before she was killed. Someone she trusted, someone whose presence on that clay road on that June morning did not alarm her. And there was something else. In the days before her disappearance, Vaudean had gotten into a heated argument with a male suitor. In any serious criminal investigation, that is your starting point. That is where you begin. Sheriff R.L. Shamblin did not begin there. Within days of Vaudean's body being found, he began arresting black men. And right there, right in that choice, Vaudean Maddox's murder was transformed from a case that might have been solved into a tool of racial terror. Her death stopped being about justice for her and started being about something else entirely, something uglier, something that had nothing to do with who actually killed her. Her real killer was never found, because nobody in a position of power ever truly looked. That is the first injustice in this story. It would not be the last. The first man Sheriff Shamblin arrested was Dan Pippin Jr. Dan was 18 years old. He had grown up less than half a mile from the Maddox home, close enough that he and Vaudean were neighbors in the way that people in small rural communities become neighbors. Familiar faces on the same roads, the same church days, the same stretches of quiet Alabama life. He had finished his education at the local one-room schoolhouse. In rural Alabama in 1933, not every black child got to do that. Dan had. He was active in his church. He sang in the choir on Sundays. He had no criminal record of any kind. By every single account that exists of who he was, Dan Pippin Jr. was a young man, carefully, quietly building a life worth having. He was also part of a local community singing club, along with A.T. Harden and Elmore Clark. 3 young men from the same community gathering together to make music. Not suspects, not criminals. Young men with voices and friendships and futures they were trying to build. Now here is the thing that makes the wrongful arrest of Dan Pippin one of the most enraging details in this entire case. Dan had an alibi. His employer, Will Jemison, a black landowner in the community, confirmed that Dan had been at work during the time of Vaudean Maddox's murder. And Jemison was not alone. Several of Dan's fellow workers confirmed the same thing. Multiple people who could account for exactly where Dan Pippin was on the morning in question. The Tuscaloosa News reported on those alibi witnesses. They were not hidden, they were not secret. They were in the papers, in print, for anyone to read. Sheriff Shamblin arrested Dan Pippin and ignored every single one of them. A sheriff in possession of documented evidence of a young man's innocence, witness accounts reported in a local newspaper, looked at that evidence and chose to proceed with the arrest anyway. That is not an investigation. That is a decision made before the evidence was examined. That is racial injustice operating at its most naked and most deliberate. 2 days after Dan Pippin's arrest, a 16-year-old boy named A.T. Harden was taken into custody. A.T. was a farmer's son. There was no physical evidence connecting him to Vaudean Maddox's murder. None. No witness had placed him near the scene. Nothing in the evidence pointed to him. He was arrested because he was a young black man in Tuscaloosa County, Alabama, in the summer of 1933. And that, it turned out, was sufficient. Now I need you to sit with what happened next, because this is the part of the story that tells you everything about how this wrongful conviction case was actually built. After 1 day behind bars, A.T. Harden confessed to having witnessed Dan Pippin commit the murder. Remember, he was 16 years old. He was alone in a southern jail cell in 1933 with no lawyer, no family member present, no legal protection of any kind. He was in Tuscaloosa County, Alabama, a county in a state where just 2 years earlier, the Scottsboro boys case had made it violently clear exactly what happened to black boys who were accused of crimes against white women. He had nobody to explain his rights to him because nobody in that jail was required to respect them. Whatever happened to A.T. Harden in that cell during that day, whatever was said, whatever pressure was applied, whatever fear was constructed around a 16-year-old boy with no one to protect him, it produced a confession. He pointed at Dan Pippin, the boy he sang with, the young man from his own community, his friend. That confession, extracted from a child in a jail cell under conditions we can only imagine, became the backbone of the prosecution's entire case against all 3 men. This is what racial terror looked like in Jim Crow, Alabama. The third man arrested was Elmore Clark. He was 28 years old. People in the community who loved him called him Honey. Clark was the oldest of the 3, a working man, and he maintained his innocence from the moment of his arrest. The case against all 3 men was built on testimony that constantly shifted and contradicted itself. The prosecution could not settle on a coherent version of events. The blame moved from one man to the next and back again, the story changing every time someone needed it to. But they had 3 black men in custody in Tuscaloosa, and in Jim Crow, Alabama in the summer of 1933, that appeared to be all the evidence that was needed. To understand what happened next in this case, you have to understand what Alabama felt like in that specific summer. 2 years earlier, in 1931, 9 black teenagers had been accused of raping 2 white women on a freight train near Scottsboro, Alabama. The Scottsboro boys case became one of the most infamous racial injustice cases in American history. The evidence was flimsy. Several of the accused were barely teenagers, but they were convicted in trials that lasted less than a day, sentenced to death, and their case became a national and international scandal. The International Labor Defense, a civil rights legal organization based in New York, had taken on the Scottsboro boys case and sent lawyers south to fight it. The white community of Alabama had reacted to those lawyers with fury. These were outsiders, northerners, communists, in the language of local newspapers and editorials, people who had no right to come into Alabama and interfere with how Alabama handled its own. By August 1933, the ILD had sent lawyers to Tuscaloosa again, this time for Dan Pippin, A.T. Harden, and Elmore Clark. The reaction was identical. The lawyers were threatened with violence. A troop of National Guardsmen had to be deployed simply to escort them out of Alabama alive. The judge ruled they could not represent the defendants, a legal technicality that stripped 3 men facing death of their best advocates at the exact moment they needed them most. And outside the Tuscaloosa County Jail, something was building. Word had spread that a white mob was forming, that they were planning to break in and take the prisoners themselves. Sheriff Shamblin heard the reports and he made a decision. Sometime around midnight on August 12, 1933, Sheriff R.L. Shamblin moved the 3 men. His stated reason was their protection. A mob was coming, he said. He needed to get Dan, A.T., and Elmore out of Tuscaloosa, transport them to Jefferson County, somewhere safer. He handcuffed them together, put them in a car, and drove them out into the Alabama night. Before they reached Birmingham, 2 carloads of armed masked men appeared on the road ahead. They blocked the sheriff's car and demanded for the prisoners. And Sheriff R.L. Shamblin, a sworn officer of the law transporting 3 men in his legal custody, handed them over. There was no resistance, no attempt to drive through, no radio call. He surrendered 3 human beings in his custody to masked men on a dark road, and those men drove them away into the night. The masked men took Dan Pippin, A.T. Harden, and Elmore Clark to a stretch of road near Woodstock in Bibb County, about 100 yards from the Tuscaloosa County line. According to the testimony Elmore Clark would later give, the masked men asked only one question: who killed Vaudean Maddox? A.T. Harden, 16 years old, months in custody, already broken once before, pointed at Dan Pippin. Elmore Clark said he was innocent. It did not matter. The mob raised their guns and fired on all 3 men. Dan Pippin was shot and killed. A.T. Harden was shot and killed. Elmore Clark survived by doing the only thing left available to him. He played dead. He lay completely still beneath Dan Pippin's body, using his friend's body as a shield, and he did not move. He did not make a sound. He listened to the masked men decide whether to check if he was still breathing, and he waited. When they were finally gone, he got himself free from the handcuffs and moved through the dark, wounded, bleeding, and barely standing. He found his way to a house belonging to a black family in Vance, Alabama, people he had never met. They took him in without hesitation and hid him in their smokehouse for 3 days. Think about the courage that took. A wounded black man arrives at your door in the middle of the night in Tuscaloosa County, Alabama in 1933. Hunted by the same system that just killed 2 men on a highway, and you open the door anyway. You hide him, you keep him alive. We don't know their names. History didn't record them, but they are part of this story. The bodies of Dan Pippin and A.T. Harden were found the next morning beneath a tree, still handcuffed to each other. Dan was 18. A.T. was 16. Nobody was arrested that night. Nobody was arrested the next day. Nobody was arrested at all. The black press reported on this racial injustice immediately and without flinching. The Afro-American ran the headline, 3 murders in 18 hours, the Pittsburgh Courier, the Black Dispatch. The newspapers that served the communities the white mainstream press had decided didn't count. They called this lynching exactly what it was, in print for the record. Governor Miller ordered a grand jury investigation. The local coroner, in one of the few genuine gestures toward accountability in this entire case, ordered the bullet-riddled bodies of Dan and A.T. exhumed so ballistics evidence could be examined. The grand jury investigation went nowhere. Sheriff Shamblin, when asked publicly about the lynching, blamed the International Labor Defense. The lawyers from New York had inflamed local tensions, he said. The ILD had brought this on. The editorial pages of Tuscaloosa's own newspapers agreed. One editorial argued that Dan Pippin and A.T. Harden were not victims of the mob. They were victims of outside interference. 2 black teenagers were dead on a highway, and the official response of the community responsible was to blame the lawyers who had tried to save them. The men who planned and carried out this lynching were never named, never charged, never tried, never held accountable in any form. Not one of them spent a single night in a jail cell for what they did on that road in August 1933. Elmore Clark, Honey, was eventually found by police and returned to custody. He had survived a firing squad, 3 days in a smokehouse, and a system that had spent nearly a year trying to destroy him. In May 1934, after sustained pressure from the National Committee for the Defense of Political Prisoners and months of national scrutiny, the murder charges against Clark were finally dropped. One black newspaper called it the sorriest case in Alabama history. Clark walked out with his life, his freedom, and the permanent damage of multiple gunshot wounds. He had lost most of the use of his right arm. He was the only reason anyone knew the full truth of what had happened on that highway, because he had survived to tell it. What Elmore Clark did with the rest of his life, history does not fully record. But he told the truth when it mattered. He told it under circumstances where telling it took real courage. And because he did, the names of the people who died beside him were not completely swallowed by silence. In 2017, 84 years after that August night, the Equal Justice Initiative erected a historical marker in front of the old Tuscaloosa County Jail. It came about in part because of 15 University of Alabama students enrolled in a course called Southern Memory, Lynching in the South. These students spent over 1,000 collective hours combing through census records, newspaper archives, and court documents, doing the careful, unglamorous work of recovering what racial terror and decades of silence had tried to bury. Their research helped build the case for that marker, and more than 1,000 people attended the dedication ceremony. The marker bears the names of the black men lynched in Tuscaloosa County between 1884 and 1933. Dan Pippin Jr. is on it. A.T. Harden is on it. 84 years. That is how long it took for the state of Alabama to put their names on a public marker and say, these men existed, these men were killed, this happened here. And Vaudean Maddox, the 21-year-old woman whose real murder was never truly investigated, whose death was turned into a weapon against 3 innocent people, her killer was never found, because nobody with the power to look ever looked seriously. Every single person in this story was failed by a sheriff, by a judge, by a courtroom, by a system that was never designed to deliver justice to black people, and that, in the summer of 1933 in Tuscaloosa, Alabama, proved it beyond any reasonable doubt. If this true crime story moved you, share it. Subscribe and leave a comment with your thoughts and any stories you would like me to cover next. I'll see you in the next one.